I'd rather marry a stranger than the dawn, I told my sister, stacking flour tins in the storeroom. I said it certain I was alone. The door was still open behind me. Rocco Costanzo didn't raise his voice. He just stood there long enough to hear every word, nodded once, and left. 3 months of a blacked-out car outside my bakery. 3 months I'd read it as a warning. I had until the block's fair to find out how wrong I was, and a debt with my bakery's name on it that was never mine to begin with. If you've ever said the true, humiliating thing about someone, certain you were alone, you know why his silence scared me more than anger would have. I keep every invoice, every torn scrap of paper, out of a habit my father taught me. That habit was the only reason I noticed the handwriting at all. He never told me what the silence meant. I spent the days that followed finding out the hard way. Talia found her voice before I found mine. Marisol. He's gone. Breathe. I didn't breathe. I set down the flour tin so carefully it made no sound at all, which felt like the only dignity left available to me. The storeroom smelled like yeast and old cardboard, and under it, faint, the cologne he wore, cedar, something bitter beneath it, gone already, the way smoke goes before you've finished coughing. My father used to say a neighborhood remembers everything except who started it. Nobody in this one could tell me when the understanding started, only that it existed, the way weather exists, something you dressed for instead of questioned. My father died owing the block a debt of respect, not money, and somewhere between his funeral and my 26th birthday, people had decided that debt would be paid in me. Nobody asked Rocco Costanzo if he wanted it. Nobody asked me either. At the funeral itself, an elder I barely knew had squeezed my hand at the graveside and told me, kindly, like a comfort and not a sentence, that I wouldn't have to run the bakery alone forever, that the right people would see to it. I'd nodded, numb with grief, and only understood a year later what the right people had meant. That handshake, I realized now, was the first clue I'd ever been handed, and I'd filed it as sympathy instead of what it actually was, a plan, already moving, that had never once needed my agreement to proceed. You didn't mean it like it sounded, Talia said, which was Talia's way of asking if I had. I had. That was the part one couldn't take back. The bakery had been my father's before it was mine, and it still smelled like him at closing, browned butter, the scorched sugar edge of the last tray out of the oven, flour dust catching gold in the streetlight through the front window. I loved it the plain, unglamorous way you love a thing that has never once asked anything of you except to be kept. I'd kept it alone for 3 years. I hadn't realized, until that week, how much of alone had actually been managed for me, one quiet errand at a time, by a man I'd just insulted in a room I thought was empty. I went to close the register instead of answering her, because closing the register was a task with an end to it, unlike everything else that week. My father's old friend next door was locking his shutters, and he lifted a hand at me the way he'd lifted it at my father for 30 years, and I lifted mine back, and for 1 block-long minute the evening looked like every other evening of my life. Then I asked him, because I couldn't help it, had he heard, from anyone, whether Rocco actually wanted this marriage everyone talked about like it was already signed. He considered the question the way he considered dough, slowly, with his hands. Word as he told the elders months back. Let her decide, or drop it. He shrugged like it cost him nothing to say and everything to be believed. Nobody drops anything on this block. You know that. I didn't believe him. I want to be honest about that, because believing him that night would have spared me 2 very bad days. That night the car came back. Black, windows I couldn't see into, parked across from the bakery the way it had for 3 weeks running, always gone the second my lights went off inside. I stood at the window with a dish towel in my hands, certain, certain, it was retaliation for the storeroom, for the words he'd heard, and I let myself be almost relieved by the certainty. A warning I understood was better than a silence I didn't. "That's not new," Talia said, following my eyes. "Remember the storm? Someone left firewood on the step. No note. I figured it was him. It hadn't been him. He burns oil, not wood. The car came back the next night too, and the one after that, always the same hour, always gone before I could get close enough to see past the glass." I started timing it without meaning to, 10:30, give or take 5 minutes, the exact hour I usually flipped the sign and locked the front door alone. On the 4th night I made myself walk out to it, dish towel still in my hand like a shield, and it pulled away before I'd crossed the street, unhurried, the way you'd pull away from a house you already knew was empty. That was the first time the fear didn't quite fit the shape of the thing frightening me. I filed it instead, the way I file everything, invoices, receipts, the little facts that don't fit yet, because my father raised me to believe a business survives on what you keep, not on what you throw away. That habit was about to matter more than anything he ever taught me on purpose. I found the torn paper behind the register the next morning, wedged where the drawer meets the wood, like it had been shoved there in a hurry. Protection fee. Overdue. Third notice. No name, no letterhead, handwriting cramped and slanted like it was trying to look like someone else's hand. My first thought was Rocco's. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. I'd spent 3 weeks readying myself to be collected on, and here, I thought, was the bill. I would come back to that thought and be ashamed of it for different reasons than I expected. I called the insurance office before I called anyone else, because a fee for protection I'd never asked for made no sense against a policy I'd paid for myself, in full, every year since my father died. The woman on the line was kind and unhurried in the way people are when they're about to ruin your morning without meaning to. "Lapsed," she said. 3 months ago. We sent the notices to the business address." "That's not possible," I said, because I paid that bill myself, in cash, the way my father always had, and I remembered doing it. "I would have seen a notice. They'd have gone through your registered contact," she said, gentle, the way you're gentle with someone about to be embarrassed. "A Mr. Voss, on file since 2019. 3 months. The same 3 months as the car outside my window." Desmond arrived early that morning to help with the books, which he had not offered to do in over a year, and I let him, because some part of me, the part that had run this bakery alone since I was 26 and trusted very few people with the ledger, still trusted Desmond Voss the way you trust a piece of furniture you've never once had reason to check underneath. He'd been my father's friend before he was mine. He'd co-signed the lease the year the ovens needed replacing, back when I couldn't get a loan on my own name, and he'd never once let me thank him properly for it. I'd built half my adult understanding of loyalty around that single unglamorous fact. "Insurance lapsed how long ago?" I asked him, watching his hands instead of his face, the way I watch a table's mood before I watch its silverware. "A month, give or take," he said, already turning a page. The woman on the phone had said 3. I didn't say anything, because saying nothing felt safer than knowing, and for one more day I let it stay that way. Stay with me, this is the part one still don't tell people the whole truth about. 2 nights later a man I didn't recognize waited until the last customer left, and stood too close to the register, and told me, pleasant as weather, that the fee was overdue and he'd prefer not to come back a 4th time. I opened my mouth to ask overdue to whom, and one of Rocco's men, Nico, the quiet one who always parked the black car, was simply there, the way furniture is there, one hand light on the stranger's shoulder. The stranger left without his coffee. He also left favoring a hand with a knuckle split fresh enough to still be shining. "Same one as Tuesday," Nico muttered, mostly to himself, and then looked like he wished the words back into his mouth. "Tuesday," I said. "There was a Tuesday?" Nico's jaw did something complicated. 3 months of Tuesdays, more or less. Boss's orders. Nobody was supposed to tell you anything. 3 months. The car. The lapse. The firewood nobody claimed. I stood there doing arithmetic I hadn't been taught how to do, the kind where every number I'd read as a threat turned out to be paid for on my behalf, quietly, by the man I'd told my sister I'd rather not marry. I didn't sleep that night for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, which was its own kind of frightening. I saw him the next afternoon from across the street, outside the hardware store, talking to an old man about a leaking roof like he had nowhere else on earth to be. He didn't posture. He didn't perform stillness the way men do when they want you to notice how calm they are. He was simply, entirely unhurried, the way weather is unhurried, the way a held breath isn't. I'd spent a week being afraid of a man who apparently spent his afternoons discussing shingles. I stood there longer than I meant to, and when he looked up and found me watching, he didn't smile, and he didn't look away first. I did. I would come back to that look on his face more than I came back to almost anything else that week. My father's old friend found me on his stoop the next evening before I could knock. He didn't wait for me to ask this time. 3 months since the policy lapsed, he said, plain as bread. Somebody's walked you home every night since. Somebody's watched this street every night since. You want to know who? It isn't a mystery on this block. It was never a mystery to anyone but you. If you've ever mistaken being watched over for being watched, you already know how small that made me feel, and how large. I went to thank Rocco properly. I'd rehearsed something almost like an apology on the walk over, and found Desmond already in his doorway, voice pitched low, breaking off the second he saw me. Rocco's face didn't change. Desmond's did. "Business," Desmond said, too fast, and left without meeting my eyes. I asked Rocco what it was about. He wouldn't hand me an accusation second-hand. "Look at your own books before you look at mine," he said, which sounded, at the time, like a man protecting a friend of mine, and turned out to be a man protecting me from doing it too fast to survive it. While I stood there deciding whether to be angry with him for not simply telling me, an old woman came up the walk with a torn coat sleeve and a grocery bag she could barely carry, and Rocco crossed the street without being asked and took the bag from her arm like it cost him nothing, and walked her the rest of the way to her door, and came back to where I was standing without a single word about it, as if it hadn't happened at all. I thought about all the small unremarkable kindnesses a person can do in a life and never once mention, and I understood, standing there, that I had been measuring this man entirely by what other people said about him, and never once by what he actually did when he thought no one was keeping score. I found the ledger 3 drawers down from where the torn invoice had been hiding, Desmond's own delivery log, kept for years in the same cramped, slanted hand. I laid the invoice beside it on the counter under the good light, and my whole body went still the way a room goes still before a storm actually arrives. The fee I'd spent a week believing was Rocco's collection was Desmond's invention. Every overdue notice had been Desmond's own hand, billing me for a threat that didn't exist, skimming the difference off a policy he'd let lapse and never told me. I confronted him with the ledger open between us like a wound. He didn't deny it. He looked older in that light than he had that morning, and tired in a way that made me want to comfort him even as my stomach turned. "Don't look any further before the fair," was all he said. Please. Just, not before the fair. Each piece alone I could have explained away, a lapsed policy, a coincidence of hands, a friend under strain. Together they meant something. I didn't have room to hold and keep loving him the way I had my whole life, that the man who taught me to trust a signature had spent 3 months forging one against me, and the man I had told my sister I'd rather not marry had spent the same 3 months quietly making sure it didn't cost me anything. I understood, underneath that sentence, that whatever he owed, and whoever he owed it to, had a deadline, and the deadline had my bakery's name attached to it. His phone lit up on the counter that same afternoon while he was in the back, and I read it before I decided to, the way you read a name called out in a crowded room before you decide whether it's yours. A crew from 2 neighborhoods over. A confirmation. $11,000, the message said, plus what he'd already lost twice trying to win it back. Fair night. The lease is collateral if he couldn't cover what he owed by then. $11,000. Not a fortune to men who dealt in buildings and blocks, but exactly enough, I understood, to be a life savings to a man too proud to ask any of us for it directly. 2 days. My bakery's own paperwork, promised to men who'd never once bought a loaf from me, timed for the one night the whole block would be too crowded to notice a quiet exchange at the back gate. Desmond came back in and read my face before I said a word. I ran out of other people to ask, he said, and it was the first true thing he'd told me all week. The fare arrived the way deadlines do, too fast and somehow, cruelly, exactly on schedule. Bunting over the street, the smell of roasting chestnuts fighting the flour smell from my own ovens, string lights strewn block to block already buzzing on in the early dusk, Talia laughing somewhere behind me with a boy I'd have to interrogate her about later, under different circumstances, in a life where this was the only thing I had to worry about. I hadn't told Rocco. The reason was simple. Some tired, stubborn part of me still needed to be the one who fixed what was mine to fix, even now, even knowing who'd been fixing things for me all along without asking credit for it. I lost Desmond twice in the crowd before I found him for real, once behind the cider stand, gone by the time I pushed through, and once near the bandstand, where a wall of teenagers in matching scarves swallowed him whole for 3 of the longest minutes of my life. My apron pocket held the torn invoice so tightly by then that the paper had gone soft at the fold. The music was too loud to hear my own pulse, and I could feel it anyway, in my throat, in my hands. I found the cruise man at the back gate near closing, exactly where the message had promised, exactly the hour it had named. Desmond stood across from him already, a folder of papers between them like a body on a table. I want you to understand I wasn't brave in the way stories make bravery sound. My hands were shaking around the torn invoice I'd carried in my apron pocket for 2 days like evidence I couldn't yet use. I walked up anyway, because the alternative was watching my father's bakery get handed to a stranger over a debt with my name nowhere on the paperwork and my whole life in every drawer of it. "This is mine," I said, to both of them, loud enough that the fare kept moving around us and nobody even slowed their step. "Whatever he told you it's worth, it isn't his to offer. Ask him what the invoices actually paid for. Ask him whose handwriting is on them." The cruise man didn't so much as blink at a woman with a piece of paper. He reached for the folder anyway, the way men do when they've already decided a conversation is over. Desmond didn't move. Desmond, for the first time in 8 days, told the truth out loud, to me, not to them. "I owe them." Not her. Me. His voice cracked on the last word in a way I will hear for the rest of my life. The cruise man reached again. And that was the only moment Rocco needed. He didn't raise his voice. I was learning, finally, all the way down, that he never spent it. He said 4 words to the man, I still don't know exactly which 4, only that they landed like a door closing somewhere far off, and the man looked past him at whatever backed those words up, and decided the fare wasn't worth it after all, and left the way people leave when the cost of staying has just changed. Rocco didn't take the invoice from my hand. He didn't finish my sentence for me. He let it be mine to say, all the way to the end, and something in me understood, standing there with cheap trumpet music somewhere behind us and my whole business still standing, that this was the entire shape of what he'd been doing for 3 months without telling me, making room for me to be the one who did it. Desmond asked, quiet, what happened to him now? You'll pay it back, Rocco said. Slowly. To me. And you'll never touch her books again. No raised hand. No spectacle. A debt transferred instead of a body found. It was, I understood later, the kindest ending available to a man who'd nearly cost me everything out of shame instead of malice. Talia found me sitting on an overturned crate by the back gate a long while after the crowd had thinned, still holding the soft, folded invoice like it might dissolve if I let go. She didn't ask what happened. She sat down next to me on the cold ground and put her head on my shoulder the way she had since she was 6 years old, and for a while neither of us said anything at all, and that quiet was nothing like the one I'd been afraid of all week. The block woke up strange the next morning, slower, kinder, the way a street sounds after a storm has actually passed instead of just threatened to. The old man next door brought over a loaf he hadn't paid for and left before I could argue about it. Desmond didn't come in. I didn't expect him to, not for a while, and some part of me already knew I'd let him back in eventually, the way you let back in anyone whose worst mistake was being ashamed instead of cruel. 3 months of Tuesdays. 3 months of firewood and idling cars and a silence I'd read as a verdict when it was closer to a vow. I went back to the storeroom that night to close up alone, the way I had every night since my father died, and Rocco was in the doorway again, not passing by this time. Waiting, because I'd asked him to. I meant it, I told him. I'd still choose a stranger over an arrangement. I know, he said. You stopped being a stranger the night you said nothing at all. I crossed the storeroom instead of turning away from it, which is a smaller sentence than what it cost me to do, and a bigger one than any I'd said all week. The torn invoice is still behind the register, refolded, tucked where the fake debt used to sit, because I like knowing exactly what it cost someone to lie to me, and exactly what it cost someone else to tell me the truth without ever once asking for credit. The doorway behind me, these days, stays empty most nights. Nobody has to be found waiting in it anymore. I used to think being chosen and being collected were the same shape from far enough away. They aren't. One of them asks first, and waits, even in silence, for as long as it takes you to hear your own voice clearly enough to answer. Would you have trusted the silence, or run from it, and how long would it have taken you to ask why he never said a word? If stories like this make your heart race, subscribe to Raven Vow.